John chapter 13, the scene is the upper room. It's Thursday night. It will be Jesus' last Passover meal. It will be Jesus' last meal that he has. John chapter 13. Once again, chronologically, this is almost Good Friday. The night before his crucifixion. And so we begin. John chapter 13, starting in verse 21. It says, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. It's got to be absolutely shocking. This has to be so hard to hear for the disciples. And I think even after hearing it, they still really don't connect all the dots. But looking from the outside in, I think it's like no wonder. No wonder why in verse 21 that Jesus was troubled in his spirit. Like truthfully, evil and wickedness should trouble us. Truthfully, evil and wickedness should cause us to be distressed, especially if it's in us. Especially if we have garbage in our own lives. And yet when we look at the story, when we look at the life of Judas, it can be so very easy to casually make comments like, well, I'm glad I'm not like Judas. I'm glad I'm not like that person or that person. I'm glad I'm not like that person or that person. Because that very thought, that's an arrogant thought. It's an arrogant thing to think. It's an arrogant thing to say. And that's because Judas is who we all would be like apart from a miracle taking place in our lives. But notice in verse 22 it says, the disciples they're uncertain of whom he spoke. No, we know it's Judas. They don't know it's Judas. And if you remember, Judas is the person that kept the money. It's not an insignificant detail about him. Remember, Judas kept the money. And you've got 12 different guys that you could possibly give this role to. You got to put one of them in charge of the money. And you think, well, we probably should put whoever is the most reliable, the most trustworthy. We should probably put the most dependable guy in charge of the money. Say, what about Peter? Nah, not Peter. He's all over the place sometimes. Don't give it to Peter. He's an emotional roller coaster. Don't. Okay. James and John? James and John? Yeah, James and John. What about James and John? Are you kidding me? The sons of thunder? Those guys wanted to rain down fire on the Samaritans because the Samaritans were rude to them. You really want to maybe give it to somebody a little bit more stable? Okay, Matthew. Can we give it to Matthew? Please tell me you're joking. You want to ask the tax collector? I mean, do you want him to relapse? That's like asking an alcoholic, hey, hold my beer. Nah, you know what? Let's give it to Judas. Let's give it to Judas. Judas is definitely the most trustworthy. They've got no clue. They've got absolutely no clue. Why would they? Some commentators have even suggested that perhaps the disciples thought that in this moment Jesus was actually referring to other disciples of his outside the 12 when he makes this comment. And yet, it says in verse 23, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved, he was reclining at Jesus' side at the table, reclining at table at Jesus' side. For the first time, the disciple whom Jesus' love is introduced, and most commentators believe this description is referring to John, the brother of James, who is the author of the fourth gospel, which sounds a little odd, perhaps in English, as if to say, I am more loved than the others. But I don't think that's how this phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved, ought to be taken. But rather in this description, I think it's probably better understood as this profound sense of indebtedness to grace, such as, what a wonder that I should be loved at all. That's probably a better understanding in the English and conveying the idea behind the words, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so he says in verse 24, so Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking, so that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? So there's Simon Peter. He's like, hey, John, ask him. Ask him what he meant. Ask him who he was talking to. And it would seem that this disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, was positioned in such a way that he's right next to Jesus. And so he's gonna kind of lean over to ask him. And some translations will say that his head was against Jesus' breast, which sounds odd. In fact, some people, when they hear this, their reaction is, that's kind of gay. Like, literally. Critics of the Bible will point this out and then suggest something nefarious. And there's nothing nefarious. To a certain degree, it's maybe an odd thing in those translations, especially in the West, in which a lack of physical proximity of two men might suggest that type of nefarious relationship. But what we have to understand is that in many parts of the world, this is just a sign of friendship, close proximity, not of homosexuality. And Jesus answered him. So Peter's like, hey, ask him. He turns, he asks him. And Jesus answered, verse 26. It is he whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. That Jesus could so easily pass the bread would suggest that Judas was close by, possibly on his immediate left, the place of honor, ironically. And the designation of Iscariot is probably associated with identifying a geographical place, a town, an area, but precisely what it may be is not clear. And growing up in the church as a little boy, I always was like, why are they all confused at this point? He just said, it's the person I'm going to hand this to. Like, as a little boy, it seemed pretty obvious. Like, it's Judas. Okay? It's Judas. So why don't they understand that Judas is the bad guy? D.A. Carson points out, and I quote, evidently Jesus makes this statement very quietly to John, because the other disciples don't seem to know what he has said. End quote. Because when Judas leaves, they don't know why he's leaving. Which, if so, John, who quite possibly is the only one who heard this, has got to be shocked, stunned, aghast. In verse 27 it says, then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, what you are going to do quickly. In chapter 13, verse 2 of John's Gospel, it says, Satan put it into his heart, and now it's escalated to the point of Satan actually entering him. Chapter 13, 2, he put it in his heart. Here, now, in verse 27, he's actually entered into him. And this, no doubt, is going to bring up, I think, a lot of questions surrounding the topic of Satan and demons and Judas' culpability in the entire matter. And so here's my best attempt to answer the questions that I'm anticipating showing up. Number one, Judas is culpable. He's culpable. He said, but Satan put it into his heart in John 13:2. Yep, he's culpable. But here in 27, he entered into him. Yep, he's culpable. Like John could have said, it's not his fault. Satan entered into him. He could have said that. He could have said, he was born this way. Not his fault. Not his fault. He grew up in a tough family situation. He was the product of his environment. He was assigned the wrong birth when he was born, without any consent to his gender preference. Could have said that, but he doesn't. He doesn't say anything. And I mean anything that could somehow indicate that he is not culpable, that he's not responsible. And I think beyond that, additionally, we got to answer this question. What does it mean that Satan put it into his heart in John 13:2 and now here in verse 27 that he's entered into him? Because God's all-knowing, right? We're like, yeah, God's all-knowing. God's omniscient. That's one of his attributes. So let me be really clear on this matter. Satan is not. God's all-knowing. Yes, Satan is not. Satan cannot read your mind. But Satan and demons can certainly make observations. And I'm guessing if someone observed you for an entire week, it would be pretty obvious what your weaknesses and vulnerabilities were. And in 13:2, we're told Satan put it into his heart. And in that moment, what we have is, I think, a certain characterization of spiritual warfare. Satan, no doubt, was keenly aware of Judas's vulnerabilities, his lust for money. And now Judas is given the idea, the thought, like a carrot dangled in front of a rabbit. And make no mistakes. Judas wants the carrot, even if it's poisonous. Even if it's poisonous. That's what sin is, right? We're like, well, I know it's sin. Yeah. And you know how when you sin, you know how you feel. You know what it's like. You know it's poisonous. You drink the glass that is the poison, it is the sin. It tastes so good going down, and then as soon as you swallow, you're like, wow, I can't believe I did that again. He wants the carrot very badly, even if it's poisonous. Or as John MacArthur would say, and I quote, Judas's greed and ambition had long since opened the door to the devil's influence. Although Satan inspired his betrayal of Christ, Judas was fully responsible for his heinous act. His own evil heart desired the same thing Satan did. Jesus' death. End quote. But now here in verse 27, we're told that Satan actually enters into him. And of course, this brings up the idea, the concept of possession. F.F. Bruce commenting says, and I quote, Satan could not have entered into him had he not granted him admission. But when a disciple's will turns traitor, Bruce writes, when the spiritual aid of Christ is refused, that person's condition is desperate indeed. End quote. The spiritual aid of Christ was refused by Judas. In fact, you might say this is his final chance when Christ hands him the bread. It's his final chance to get it right. And as MacArthur notes, Judas spurned Christ's final gesture of love to him, just as he had all the previous ones for the last 3 years. Now, it says in verse 28, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So no one understands why Jesus said this to him, except for John, though how much he actually understood at this moment seems somewhat ambiguous. Judas, he's gone. Judas has left. And here's the thing I want to say about Judas. It's not that Judas lost his salvation, but rather Judas was a really good pretender. He didn't lose his salvation. He was just really, really good at faking it. And the truth is, some people can pretend so well that they even fake themselves out. James 1:22 warns about this sort of self-deception. He says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. And I say that because there's no reason to think that Judas was anything but sincere in his faith. No reason at all. And within modern day Christendom today, oftentimes I think we mistakenly track the gospel, explain the gospel in such a way that, well, if you're really sincere and you believe it with all your heart, like sincerity has nothing to do with it. Judas was a sincere guy. He was also a self-deceived guy. Like here was the guy. Think about this. This is the guy we would say, man, he's actively involved in ministry. Here was a guy, he came every Sunday. Here's a guy, he came to every love feast. He came to every game night. He came to every small group. Here was a guy, he was on the mission trip that helped serve on the worship team and the tech team. Like here was a guy that even regularly preached, and they were great sermons. Bottom line is this. You can be the most sincere person in the room and still be deceived. Just Look at Judas. He served with Jesus for 3 years. When Jesus fed the 5,000, Judas would have been there distributing food with the other disciples. When Jesus calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee, Judas would have been there in the boat. He's in the boat, watching him tell the wind and the waves, be still. He's in the boat. He would have heard the parable of the prodigal son. He would have known that God is always ready to welcome and forgive those who've wandered away. And yet Judas still betrayed Jesus. For Judas, I think it's fair to say, there was a secret sin in his life that he never truly dealt with. A secret sin in his life that he never really confessed, that he never really owned. And if you ask me, I think that's where he went wrong. And that's because unconfessed sin exposes our vulnerabilities to our adversary, the devil, or as Peter would say, the devil, he is like a roaring lion seeking to devour you. Paraphrase, you're actively, each and every one of you, you are actively being hunted. We don't think about it because we don't want to think about it. But we are actively being hunted. It is life and death. And so few people understand this. They just don't get it. Because Judas was a guy who seemed to have it all together. That's why no one at the table at this last Passover meal would have had, with like 100 guesses, ever considered that Judas was the one that would betray the Son of Man. Judas himself was so self-deceived despite his own sincerity. And the truth is, he's not alone. There are countless, thousands, if not millions of people who think they know Jesus, but they don't know Jesus. And they're going to meet him one day. And they're going to find out that they have been deceived into thinking that they have a saving relationship with him when he doesn't know who they are at all. And in turn, they're going to receive judgment. And they will be welcomed into the fires of hell for all eternity. It's a sobering thought. For example, active involvement in ministry is good. You should be plugged into a local church. If you're not, you're missing out. I'd actually go so far to say if you're not plugged into a local church, you're probably wrong. But active ministry, that's a truly wonderful thing. But it is not in itself a guarantee of spiritual life or health. As verse 30 says, so after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out and it was night. That's ominous. I don't think it's accidental that he tells us that it was night. I don't think it's simply to describe the time of day either. In fact, when you go all the way back to John chapter 1, verse 5, the beginning of John's gospel, we were told how the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. In fact, a few hours later in the garden, in Luke's gospel, in Luke 22:53, Jesus will say, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. It's now night. It is the hour for the power of darkness. It is ominous. It's like the beginning scene at Helm's Deep where Theoden delivers his famous line and says, and so it begins. It is night in John's gospel. Remember, Luke's gospel, he would describe it, this is your hour in the power of darkness. John's gospel, it is night. But there is a silver lining. There is something to hope for. As John Piper points out, there is a limitation that is put on the darkness. Did you catch that? There's a limitation on the darkness. Jesus says right here, he says, this is your hour. In other words, the darkness is limited. The night is limited. This is your hour. It's not your century. It's not your decade. It's not your year. It's not your month. It's not your week. It's going to last until Sunday morning. And that's it. In other words, darkness is on a leash. The night will not last forever. There are dark seasons. that all of Christ's disciples face, that some of you, even right now, I don't know, might be facing in this exact moment. But make no mistake, they are seasons. At some point, morning comes. At some point, spring comes. At some point, the night will turn into morning and morning into day. The powers of Satan are limited, praise God, by only what God permits and signs off on. And so, verse 31, it says this, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. It's very reminiscent right now of Isaiah 49:3, which says, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. And it is at the heart of everything God does. Everything God does is for God's glory. Even painful things, though we don't always understand it. Everything is for God's glory. Everything. Jesus has perfectly revealed the Father through his life to mankind. Ergo, the way God is glorified in Jesus is going to be through his obedience, through his sacrifice, through his death, through his resurrection, and his exaltation. And so he says in verse 33, little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me. And just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. The word, the phrase, little children in the Greek, it only occurs here in John's Gospel. And not only is this the only place that the word is used in John's Gospel, it is the only place it's used in the entire New Testament, except for John's other letters. He's the only writer to employ this term, little children. It's for this reason that the commentators suggest that this story in the upper room must have had a profound impact on John, who's writing this. John calls them, quoting Jesus, little children. See, the reason he tells them that they can't come with him is because he knows they're not able to come. He's like, Peter, you're not even going to make it through the night before you disown me. And it's not just Peter. John 16:32 tells us it's the whole group. That's why he says, where I am going, little children, you cannot come. And furthermore, the other reason they can't follow Jesus on this night is that Jesus is about to do what only Jesus can do. Because that's the gospel. He's going to take their place. He's going to be their substitute. Jesus is effectively saying, I'm going to go die for you. And in doing so, I'm going to be the bridge for you to the Father. And only I can do this. This is my work alone. I'm going to pay for all your sins. I'm going to pay for all your failures. Then you will come through me, trusting me, because no one comes to the Father except through me. That's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm making a way for sinners to come to the Father, and only I can do it. You can't follow me now, guys. And this is all very good news for all of us. And so he says in verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. The commandment he gives is to love one another, just as he loved us. That's the commandment. Love one another. And I think one of the reasons that people struggle with the love of Christ is because they don't properly understand their own sin. The reason a lot of people today struggle with really grasping what the love of Christ is, what it looks like, what it means, what the implications are, is because they don't fully grasp their own sin. In fact, I would argue that the more you grasp and deal with the weight of your sin, the brighter the love of Christ actually shines. And this in turn tends to be true, especially during witnessing encounters. And here's what I mean. When you share the gospel with someone right away, usually the very first thing that many people will do is object to their sin. That's why the phrase, I'm a good person, finds its way into so many different conversations in which the person doesn't think they have a need for the gospel. They don't see it as good news for them. Maybe for others, not for them. And that's because they don't comprehend just how terrible their sin is. And so Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you. But bottom line is this: if you're a follower of Jesus, you are a person under authority. If you're a follower of Jesus, you don't call the shots anymore. If you're a follower of Jesus, this verse isn't a suggestion. This isn't a new idea. This isn't a new possibility. This isn't a multiple choice. This isn't optional. It's a command. And someone's going to point out, well, can it really be a new command? I mean, in the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So in what way is this new? That's what I would say if I was sitting there listening to this sermon. And I think the answer is this: it's new in that the pattern for this love is Jesus. The example for this is Jesus. And oh, by the way, what example did he just perform in a shocking cultural act of humility before this dinner took place? He washed their feet. He washed their feet. Something that only servants would have done in this culture, not their revered rabbi. He set aside his own status to serve them, to love them. That's the example that he gave, that is embedded and tied up in this command to love one another. And so Simon Peter said to him, verse 36, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. And Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus answered, will you? Really? Paraphrase. Seriously? Paraphrase. Lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. In many manuscripts, it mentions the rooster crowing twice, but roosters, they could actually crow multiple times, separated by a few minutes. In Mark's gospel, it specifies the first 2, whereas Matthew, Luke, and John make the shameful denial of Peter the focal point. Apparently, it was actually it was very normal for roosters in Palestine to crow about 12:30 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 2:30 a.m., prompting the Romans to give the term the cock crow to the watch between midnight and roughly 3 a.m. So Jesus gave this new command. And Peter's like, I have a question about the commandment? No. About what I mean by new? No. About the application of it? No. I want to talk about something completely different. Of course you do, right? So some of you guys have classes where there's a person like Peter in the class. Like, dude, put your hand down. I had a class like that, right? Every time the guy raised his hand, I'm like, he doesn't have a question. He just wants to like take the class off topic or inject his opinion so we all know how smart he is. So, he presumably, Peter and the other disciples, they really have this single-minded concern. And that is Jesus leaving. In fact, if you notice, they don't seem to be super interested in this new commandment, which is sort of the whole point of the story. He's like, I'm leaving, and here is my final wish. If you hear anything at all, hear this. Hear this one thing. And they're like, forget your final thing. Can we go back to you leaving for a moment, please? We don't want you to leave. I know, but I am. Well, then we want to come with you. That's just not an option, but we love you. And then you wonder why he calls them little children. The parents in here are like, yep, I had that conversation yesterday. Jesus is like, dude, Peter, you're going to pretend you don't know who I am in a few hours because you're embarrassed of me when you face the pressures of the world. And the truth is that this is what every believer will face, and that is the cultural pressures from society. And today they are increasing at a rapid rate. I don't think it's accidental. I'm preaching this sermon 2 weeks before what we call Pride Month, which name is ironic when you think about it, because this is not something at all that you should be proud of. It's just a celebration of sin. That's what it is. I mean, talk about cultural examples that pressure Christians like Peter to deny Christ and conform. Like Peter is so jazzed. He's so energetic in this moment. He's like, man, I'll die for you. I'll go wherever I have to. I'll crawl over broken glass. Like, for many of us like Peter, we mistakenly think that our enthusiasm will carry us to the finish line. Enthusiasm will always run out before we make it to our final destination. That spiritual high from a camp, from a sermon, from whatever, like, it's going to run out. In other words, we need something else. We need something more to get us where we need to be, to get us to the finish line. And in case you don't know the answer is Jesus. It's usually, if you have a test, don't know what to put down Jesus. You'll probably get it right. Jesus is the answer. Like, we need Jesus. We need Jesus to help us finish well. We need God's power so that we don't cower to the culture, so that we don't run away, so that we don't, like Peter, deny Christ before man. Make no mistake about it. If it wasn't for the grace of God in our lives, we would, like Judas, exchange our relationship with Jesus for something else. And even with God's grace, sometimes we still, like Judas, exchange our relationship with Jesus for other things. Some of us have this week. Even Peter does it when he feels the pressure from society, be it temporarily. Peter does it. He exchanges his relationship for cultural acceptance. But here's the big difference. Here's the huge difference. Peter repents. Peter seeks forgiveness. Peter mourns and grieves his sin. Judas does not. Peter repents. Judas feels regret. Like they both feel bad. They both feel shame. But Peter turns back to Christ, whereas Judas only turns inward toward his own self-pity. Oh, that we would be on guard against the sort of self-deception that leads us, like Judas, to be so close to Christ, so near to Christ, without ever truly knowing Him in a saving way. Lord, help us. Jesus, don't let us be self-deceived, God.